Installation issues. In this nugget, we're going to continue our discussion of installation issues. We'll start off by looking at how to set up and perform an installation over the network. Then we'll look at Kickstart, which is a Red Hat tool to automate the install process. And we'll wrap up by talking about the bootloaders Grub and Lilo. So let's get started. Alright, well in this nugget on installation issues, we're going to start by talking about network installation. How do we install Linux over a network using the network file system or FTP or HTTP as our protocol? And then we're going to move on and talk about Kickstart, which is a very cool tool that automates the installation process. Okay, so if you need to install Linux on a bunch of machines that are basically identical, you're going to want to use Kickstart because it's going to wind up saving you a lot of time. So we'll talk about how to configure and then how to set up and use Kickstart. And then we'll talk about the bootloaders Grub and Lilo at the end there. Okay, so for network installations, this is a pretty detailed topic. Okay, so what I want to do first is just kind of give you an overview of what a network installation is and how it's going to work, and then we'll move out to the Linux screen and talk about how to do each of these things step by step in more detail. Okay, so first, before we talk about what I've written down here, let me just draw you a picture. Okay, here's the machine that we want to install Linux on. Let's call this the client machine. Okay, so typically what we did in the introductory Linux series was we took the Linux CDs, okay, and we stuck the CD into the machine and we turned on the machine. And the machine booted off of the CD. This was a bootable CD. Okay, so basically it booted up some minimal version of Linux. So then we could run the installation program and read the rest of the packages and the kernel and everything else off the CD, and then the client would have a full version of Linux on it. Okay, and it wasn't just one CD, you know, maybe it was 2 CDs or 3 CDs depending on what version of Linux we were talking about. Okay, well now what we're going to do is instead of taking that CD and sticking it into the client computer, we're not going to do that anymore. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to set up another computer over here that's already running Linux. Let's call that the server, and we're going to copy all that information from the CD onto the hard drive of this server. Okay, now these machines are hooked up over the network, and what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to boot up the client and then read all this information off of the hard disk on that server. Okay, so the method of protocol here that we're going to use to transfer this data from the server to the client could be the network file system, it could be FTP or HTTP. Probably the two most common ones are NFS and FTP. Okay, so that's what happens. All right. Now, what we have to do is we have to boot up this client machine with a minimal version of Linux, just like we did when we stuck the CD in. The first thing that happened was we booted up the client with a minimal version of Linux. Then we did the full installation. Well, we have to do the same thing again, and the way that we're going to do it now is we're going to take a floppy disk and stick that floppy disk into the client computer. That boot floppy that we stick in there has to have this file on it called bootnet.image. Okay, bootnet.image is on disk 1 of your installation media in the /images directory. Okay, so in /images is bootnet.image. There's other image files called boot.image. They're probably the two most common ones. But we need bootnet.image so that we can do a network installation. All right? So bootnet.image is on the floppy, we boot up the client in the minimal version of Linux, and then it prompts us, it says, okay, how do you want to install Linux? Before, when we stuck the CD in, this is where we would type Linux text, for instance. Okay, to do a text installation of Linux. Well, now what we're going to type is Linux ask method, and it's going to come along and say, okay, what do you want to do? Do you want to do a network installation? That's going to be one of our choices. So we'll choose network installation, and then it's going to say, okay, where's this server out here? What protocol are you going to use? What directory on this server are you getting that information from? That sort of stuff is all going to be prompted for us. Okay, so we'll have to answer all those questions. Right? And that's how we're going to install Linux on this client machine. All the data is going to be transferred over the network. And this isn't the only computer on the network, right? There's all sorts of other computers on the network, and we can install Linux on any of these other computers that are hooked up to the server on the network. Okay, now what we have to be careful of is how do we set up this server? That's actually where probably the bulk of the work is. Okay, well first you have to make sure you have enough space on the server, and the way to estimate that is take 650 megabytes times the number of CDs that you have in your installation pack. Okay, so for 2 CDs you need 1300 megabytes or 1.3 gigabytes. Then we need to copy that data from the CD onto the server's hard drive. And then once we do that, we need to make sure that data that we just copied onto the hard drive is accessible remotely so that those other machines out on the network can actually read this data. Okay, so that's what we have to do to set up the server, and then you saw in the last picture what we're actually going to do in the installation process. We're going to boot up the client machine and so on. All right, so that would use up pretty much all of my available space. If I wasn't using this machine for anything else, if I wasn't hosting user accounts or anything else on this machine, it's fine. It'll fit on there and I can do it. And for the illustration of this idea, you know, we'll just assume that I'm going to do it on this machine. Okay, so the way that I'm going to move this over is all the data is I'm going to use the copy minus AV command. I'm going to say from mount CD-ROM to a directory on my machine. Actually, let me make that directory first. I'm going to make a directory and I'm going to call it Red Hat install, RH install. Okay, right at the top level. Okay, so if we go to the top level directory and do an ls, you'll see now there's a directory Red Hat install, and that's where we're going to copy to. So I'm going to say copy minus AV from mount CD-ROM to RH install. Now the A command here is for archiving. That's so that you preserve all the permissions, the directory structure, it does everything recursively, and V is just verbose. Okay, so this is going to copy all the information from the CD to the RH install directory, and you have to do this for each CD. Okay, so the first CD is in the drive now. I'll do it. Then I would take it out, mount the CD. You know, I would unmount the CD, take it out, put the new one in, mount it, and do this all over again for each of the CDs. Okay, I'm not going to do this because it's very time consuming, and I'm actually not setting up the server to do this, so I just wanted to show you what you have to do to get this to work. So I'm just going to hit Control-C here. Alright, so now once you copy over the data for each of the two disks, then what you need to do is make sure that it's accessible to everybody else on the network. So let's just assume that we're setting it up for an NFS install. That's probably the most common way to do it. So for a network file system install, what we have to do is go to the etc directory and edit the exports file. Okay, so we're going to edit the exports file. I'm going to use Emacs to do that. Let me just make this a full screen here so we can see. You can see the file's empty right now. I haven't set up any sharing of directories on my system. So what I'm going to do here is I specify the directory that I want to share, RH install. I say who can share it, who on the network is allowed to read this directory, and I'll just say okay, so there I'm going to do this, I'm going to hit enter, and now the copying is taking place. This is actually going to take a couple minutes because floppy disks are so darn slow, and so I'm just going to pause the video and I'm going to come back to show you what the result of this is. Alright, well that's all there is to it. There's the output of this command. It tells you how many records it read in, how many records it spit out to the floppy, and now the floppy disk has this bootnet.image on it. And now what we're going to do is go ahead and put that floppy disk into a new machine and look at how we would do a network installation using this floppy disk. Alright, so let me walk you through some screenshots of what happens when you put in that boot image floppy that we just made, bootnet.image. You stick that in the computer and you turn it on. Then this is the first screen that you get where you have to do something. Okay, it comes up with this boot prompt down here, and this is where we would type like Linux text if we were doing a text mode install. But now what we would type is Linux ask method. Okay, now this is going to do the network install on this client machine. Alright, so once I hit enter there, then it says, you know, it's loading VM Linus, which is the kernel. It goes through some other ugly screens of all sorts of detailed information about what it's doing. And then it starts to ask questions about the installation itself. What language do you want to use during the installation? We're going to use English. What type of keyboard? We have a US keyboard. And then the important stuff is what type of media contains the packages to be installed. So let's first walk through an NFS image. Alright, I'll hit OK, and now it asks you for information about the client machine, the machine that you're installing Linux on. Alright, so if you're using the dynamic IP configuration stuff like DHCP, then you make sure that's starred. otherwise you would hit spacebar there to unstar that, and you'd fill in these 4 fields: the IP, the net mask, the gateway, and the name server for that client machine that you're installing Linux on. Okay, I'm using this, so I'm going to go forward there. And then it's asking you, once you give the client information, it's asking you for the server information. So what's the name of the server? What's the directory on that server where the client can get the installation? Answer a bunch of questions. All right, so you know, you're going to be prompted. Now, if there is one required option out there that's going to change from system to system, then, you know, maybe this is the only way to go. But no, just be aware that if you leave out a required option, it's going to stop the installation process and wait for your answer. All right. So once you've got the configuration file, either by modifying those samples or by using the graphical user interface, then you actually have to use Kickstart when you do in the installation, when you boot up. Okay, so one way to use Kickstart is to copy this configuration file that you made over to a boot floppy. Then you boot off that boot floppy, and when you get to that boot prompt, you type Linux ks equals floppy. This is probably the most common way to use Kickstart. All right, and then what's going to happen is the program's going to read the Kickstart configuration file, look at all the options, and go ahead and just do the whole installation. If this is set up correctly, this is the last thing you type. You don't have to answer any more questions. That's a very efficient use of your time, right? You just boot off the floppy and type that, and you're done. Now, another way to do it is you might have the KS configuration file on a network somewhere. And in that case, when you get to the boot prompt, you type Linux ks equals NFS : the IP address of the machine where the configuration file lives, and colon, and then the directory and the name of the file where it lives. Okay, so if this server out here is like an HTTP server, then you would start that with HTTP : instead of NFS : Okay, if it's an FTP server, it would start with FTP : and so on. Okay, so these are probably the 2 most common ways to use Kickstart. There's some other ways out there. You can consult the documentation if you think you have some other way that you'd like to do it, but these are probably the 2 most common ways. So now that we understand the basic process of Kickstart and how to use it, let's go back and look at those configuration files and how to use the GUI out on the Linux screen. Okay, well now let's look at these Kickstart configuration sample files, and I'm going to show you a resource where you can learn which of the options in the Kickstart configuration file are optional and which ones are required. Okay, so we're in the root user's home directory here, and let's just look at this Anaconda ks config file. Okay, so this is the one that mirrors the installation we did on this computer Nugget. Okay, so I'm going to hit enter here, and this is the first page of the Kickstart configuration file. And you can see it's just line after line. Basically, think of it like a Linux command, and then the double dashes followed by some option, and then some qualifier for those options potentially. Okay, so that's kind of the way it's laid out. Each line takes care of some facet of the installation. Like the language is English US, the keyboard is US, the mouse is a generic PS2 mouse, and I've got the emulate 3 button qualifier there. Okay, and it just goes on and on. There's all sorts of stuff in here. The firewall, the authentication configuration. I have shadowed passwords and MD5 encryption. My time zone, where the location of the bootloader is. That sort of stuff is in here. Okay. Now, as you go down, here's partition information. Now, this hash sign or the sharp sign here in the front is means it's commented out. So this stuff is not active by default. Okay, so if you want this to be active, if you want this stuff to take effect, you have to, remove those pound signs, those sharp signs. Okay, and the reason that this is commented out is just because this is a pretty sensitive part of the installation, right? One thing to note here is that, like I said before, if you're installing on a bunch of basically identical machines, that's when Kickstart really pays off. The machines don't have to be exactly identical. And one example where they don't have to be exactly identical is shown in this partition information. You can see here that there's a partition. It's mounted on /. Okay, that's where it's mounted in the files in the directory tree. The size of the partition is here, and then you can see there's a -- grow option on that partition. Now, what this means is the other partitions are fixed in size. Okay, this one has grow on it, but it has a max size of 512 for the swap partition. This one though has language you're using, what mouse, what's your time zone, what's the root password, should you encrypt the root password, language support, do you want to reboot after installation, all those sorts of things are under basic configuration. The installation method is another screen. Are we doing a new installation or are we upgrading an existing one? Are we installing from a CD, NFS, FTP, HTTP? Are we using a hard drive installation? We didn't talk about this installation. This basically just involves copying the ISO image off the CD to a hard drive partition if you've already formatted the hard drive, and then you can do the installation right off the hard drive. I don't find this to be very useful. I just skipped over it. Okay, bootloader options, okay, for Grub and Lilo, which we're going to talk about next when we wrap up. Partition information. What do you want to do for partitions? Do you want to remove existing partitions, preserve them, and so on? Okay, network configuration. Are we using DHCP, or if we're using a static IP, then we have to fill out this field. You can see it's sort of lit up there. Okay, authentication. Are we using shadow passwords, MD5? Are we using NIS? Are we using Kerberos? Hesiod is something to do with Hesiod has something to do with Kerberos. We'll talk about that in a later video, how to configure all that. Firewall configuration. Is it high? Should we use default firewall rules? Are we going to customize it? And then we would have to go down what kind of traffic we would allow to come through the firewall. Okay, X configuration, do you want to configure this? Do you want to put in a video card and a monitor? That sort of stuff. Package selection, pre-installation script and a post-installation script. We saw a post-installation script in the Anaconda sample configuration file. That's where it added the user Perry and so on, and added the password for Perry. There's also a place where you can do a pre-installation script. Okay, warning here is an error in this script might cause your Kickstart installation to fail. Do not include the percentage pre command at the beginning. They'll put that in for you when you're done. You should just type the commands in the script. They list the commands that you have at your disposal down here. You can use up and down keys to boot various operating systems in this list. If we had a dual boot operating system, there would be a DOS or a Windows element in here, but we don't, so we only have one thing in the list. E to edit the commands before you boot, A to modify kernel arguments, VM line is 3 to boot into run level 3, or VM line is 1 to boot into run level 1, or single user mode. You can actually type VM line is single there as well to boot into single user mode. Okay, so Lilo is actually a little bit easier to boot into an alternate run level. You don't have to go through as many steps. You just have to type a different command at the boot prompt. Once you're done in single user mode, you can type reboot and it will boot back to the default run level so that things like X Windows and various things start. Okay, so so that's how you do it in Lilo. Note that Lilo will be removed from Red Hat Linux eventually. They've been saying this for a while. It's still there. It's still part of the system, but it will be removed eventually, and that's probably a good reason to use Grub, just because it's going to be around for longer in Red Hat. Alright, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on installation issues. We continued our discussion of installation issues by first talking about network installs. So we learned how to install Linux over the network, whether that network's a local network with running like networked file system, or FTP or HTTP. And then we talked about Kickstart, which is a program that automates installation so that you don't have to go around and do an install on multiple computers. You can set up a configuration file and run the Kickstart program, and then that will do the install on all the computers in an identical fashion. And we wrapped up our discussion with Grub and Lilo, just a brief discussion of Grub and Lilo, just to preface what's to come in the next few videos. We're going to need to know a few things about Grub and Lilo. Alright, well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.